I was inspired by the cozy jogger hack for the Chanterelle View B pants by So Liberated. There's a hack on their blog, and I know that this is probably one of their most popular hacks, and I can see why. I wanted a pair of cozy joggers myself. So I'm gonna make a pair, and I'm using the blog as inspiration for this. Since my machine and materials are a little different, I'm gonna adjust my project accordingly. But I'm gonna go over the steps in the blog and the steps on how I'm gonna do what I'm doing today. So mine is going to differ in that I'm adding a little bit of rib knit to the pocket opening here. And I'm also going to serge the elastic into the seam here. So this whole waistband was serged to the pants themselves. So that's a couple of my changes. I'm gonna use some eyelets for my drawcord opening because I have a box that I need to get through, but the buttonhole works really good as well. And I'm going to make my drawcord using some fabric here. So if you have a drawcord, you can use that as well. I'll be trimming the cuffs in rib knit, but this pair here, I used the self fabric just like they do in the blog, except that I made them a little bit wider. And I'm going to also turn under the pocket edge rather than leave it raw, just because I really like challenging myself sewing curves and I'm always trying to get better at some of these things. So I thought I would stick with the pocket and try and sew it on the best I can. All right, let's make some cozy joggers. So let me show you the post that inspired me on the So Liberated blog. So here we are on their website, and if you go up here at the top and click the blog, and you'll see categories on the right here, and if you click Chanterelle Pants, it'll take you to all the blog posts that have the chanterelles in it. And they've pinned this first one here, the Winterizing Chanterelle Pants Cozy Jogger. So this is it right here. And you can see really how cute these are. So I definitely wanted my own pair. So right here you can see a really nice close-up shot of the pocket, and she left the pocket opening just as is. I think her only modification was sewing it slightly differently, where she didn't turn under the edge on the inside and top stitch it down. She just left it flat, overlocked it, left it flat. You don't even need to overlock it. That way it's less bulky, and that's this little stitch right here. She added a drawcord to make them a little bit more jogger-ish. And then on the back pockets here and on the front pockets, but you can't quite see, she trimmed off all of the seam allowance and then just left that edge raw and top stitched the pockets to the pants that way, which is great. Knits don't fray. So if you're up for that look and that's what you want to do, this is how she did hers, and it looks really cute. So I'm going to do mine a little differently. I'm going to clean finish them by turning it under. I'm basically doing that because I actually did buy matching rib for a little zipper jacket that I'm making to match my joggers, so I have the ribbing, I'm going to use it. So she takes you through a lot of her modifications here, how she modified her pockets by trimming off the seam allowance on her pattern piece here, and you can see how it's flat and top stitched down there. And then she also shows you how she went about making the self cuffs. I'm only making mine a little bit wider. I'm gonna use rib on the cuff because I have it, but you can see on my green pair, I did just what she did as well. I just made it a tiny bit wider. And then here's her instructions on adding the drawcord opening here. So she used a buttonhole. I think buttonholes are great. So she takes you through how to add buttonholes to the waistband if you want to add a drawcord. I'm going to use eyelets because like I said, I have a box of these to get through. You can also see that she sewed this very similar to the instructions that are on Chanterelle's View B already. And I'll be serging my elastic in the waistband as all one unit to the pants, just for a different type of finish. So, all right, let's do it. There's timestamps in the description if you want to jump to any certain step, especially because right now I'm going to show you a few of the pattern modifications. If you want to get right to the sewing, just skip right to that. So my fabric today is a sweatshirt fleece. And it's a pretty thick sweatshirt fleece, and it's pretty stable. It doesn't have a ton of stretch either direction. You can pretty much cut your chanterelles in a stable fabric like this without many fit concerns. If you're using a fabric that has a lot of stretch, you might find that they're going to feel a little larger than usual. So you might want to check that out and kind of give yourself some room to fit them along the way. So mine doesn't have a lot of stretch either direction. It's a pretty stable fabric. You can tell also it does not fray at all. So I could do the method where I just stitched this raw on top of the pants. I'm adding this rib knit right here. So you can pretty much use your pattern as is. There's just probably a few things you want to do differently depending upon if they're bulky or if you want to finish your seams. One of the main things I would at least recommend is trimming down your seam allowances. 5/8 is quite a bit for sewing knits together. Pretty much need just only about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter for your seam allowances. And so I have trimmed them down along the side seam, the rise, the inseam, the cuff, and the waist. So all the edges, I've trimmed them down to 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to do the same on my pockets, and I'm going to do that on my cuff as well, but I'm also making my cuff a tiny bit wider. Let me show you how I made the change to the pockets and added this rib here. So here's our pocket piece, and right now the perimeter edge is the usual pocket size. And this pink line on the inside is the seam line. This right here from pink line to cut edge is the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Just trimming this down to make it a 3/8 inch seam all the way around would be to this green line here. So I would trim it off all the way around where this green line is. And then I'm set to go. I can still use the pocket facing as long as I've trimmed those seams down as well. And everything's gonna sew together, and I can do it just like Meredith did, unless I wanna trim this edge here to have that raw look. All right, so now we have our pocket to the 3/8 inch seam allowance all around the edges. Now I need to trim down this opening. If I want it to still finish right here, I need to trim this down and then figure out how much to make my rib cuff. So I'm gonna use a little piece of paper here as well. So now if I want my band here to finish 3/4 of an inch, that means that finished edge is going to land where this pink edge is right here. So if we draw a 3/4 inch parallel line to the finished pocket opening, this will be our new seam right here. And then from here to here would be ribbing. So there we have our ribbing. And now what I need is seam allowance on this new seam edge here. So we would add 3/8 to that edge parallel. And now that is my new cut line if I want a pocket with a rib knit opening. Working on the seam line always makes things like this a lot less confusing. All right, so now we have our pocket piece, but we need the ribbing. And the best way to figure out ribbing on necklines, openings, anything like this, where this edge where it sews and where it finishes are two different lengths, because if you were to measure this pocket here, you were to measure along this seam here, but you were to measure at this fold here, this edge here would measure less than this seam right here. And this is the length that we want because it's meant to stretch, right? So this edge right here is not stretched and this one is stretched. So this one's at a relaxed state. If you want to learn more about how to do this for like a neckband and you're having trouble getting your t-shirt neckbands to lay flat, and every time you sew it, it turns out something a little different because it's a different fabric. I have a video and it's linked in the description about this because it is kind of a subtle little thing, but it makes complete sense once you figure out how to figure out what length to make that neckband. It's not just 80%. That will not work for some fabrics. Sometimes you get lucky. That used to be kind of the school of thought, but there are so many different ways to construct your t-shirts and things like that, and so many different fabrics that you really need to just know the math, and then it will work out every time. So you might have to have a pattern piece for every different fabric you use, but at least it'll work. Back to our joggers. So here we have our pocket, and now I'm gonna trace this edge here to make this easier. And now I'm gonna draw in my seam line. I'm going to erase my cut edge so it's really clear to you what I'm doing. And we're just looking at the finished pocket opening along here. We still have seam allowance along this edge, the waist and the side seam, and that's completely fine. And now I'm just going to darken it with some marker. All right, so here we have our pocket opening. This is the finished edge. That's the waist and the side seam, and these both still have seam allowance, and that's fine. So now what we're going to do is we're going to draw in our rib opening here as if it's sewn in. So we're just going to draw in this 3/4 inch parallel line here. And now what we want to do is we want to measure from this end to this end along this interior curve. So I'm going to measure along this curve here. So for this size, it's 7 7/8. Now what I need to know, that's the length of our piece, but we need to know the width. And the width of our piece, we're going to flip the paper over. All right, so now we're going to draw a rectangle. And we're just going to do 3 of the sides. We're going to do the one long side and the 2 short sides, and we're going to make it the length that we just determined, because that is our cut length. And now we just need to know the width. So now I want my rib here to finish 3/4 of an inch wide. So we know we need seam allowance on each long side. So there's 3/8 or 1 centimeter. And then now I'm going to add the width of my ribbing finish, 3/4 of an inch. And now I need to do the same exact thing because it's folded along this edge right here. So we'll add our 3/4 and we'll add our 3/8. So now we have the finished length and the finished width of our cut rib piece for the pocket opening. And we know that it's going to lay flat because we measured it along this interior curve here, and it's going to stretch to fit the opening, no problem, because it's ribbing. So that's our pattern piece there, and we're set to start sewing. I'm going to be using my serger to mostly assemble all the elements of the Chanterelle joggers, and my single needle straight stitch for attaching the pockets and the waistband. We're going to be switching between both machines. So over here at the serger, we're going to finish the top edge of the pocket, and because I'm going to top stitch my pocket down with the edge turned under, I'm also going to overlock around the perimeter. I've trimmed off 1/4 inch around the rounded edge here, so it's not the 5/8 seam. And then the same thing here, we're going to attach our rib knit here to the opening, and then I'm also going to overlock around this edge, and you saw that I've already trimmed away 1/4 inch. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to attach our rib. We're going to fold it in half, and we're going to place it right sides together. I'm going to overlock this at 3/8 of an inch. And I like to get it started, and then I hold the other end, and I'm going to place it to the end here, and now I'm just going to hold it and position it as I sew. You could also clip it to the edge if that makes you feel good too. I'm trimming a tiny bit off since my seam finishes about 1/4 of an inch. There we go, just like that. And then the seam will get pressed toward the pocket, and I'm going to top stitch it down on my other machine. Now the other step I'm going to do here is I'm going to overlock just this round edge here. And now we'll repeat for the other pocket. Now for my back pockets, I'm going to just overlock around all the edges here. Now I have a hem here that I can clean finish like this, or I could overlock this edge and lay it flat and just top stitch it down, which would be less bulky. So we're going to overlock this edge, and then we're going to overlock the perimeter. You'll notice that I didn't interface my pocket edge here, and you can if you like. If you want that extra stability for your pocket, that's a great idea. And if you're sewing the pockets, the front pockets with the facing, you can interface that if you like as well. All right, so now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna iron this edge under here so that it's ready to top stitch. Now, if you don't have a serger or an overlock, or you just don't wanna use it on this step, and you're having trouble turning this under because you still plan on turning it under and top stitching it, you can zigzag this edge, and that will give you a little bit of stability to fold back. You could also just run a straight stitch just inside that seam line there, and then gently pull on the bobbin threads to sort of draw it up and tighten it, and then you'll get a nice little curve. And you really only need to do that like from here to here along the curved edge there. You can just put a little stitch there, pull on that bobbin thread from each end, kind of just tighten it a tiny bit, and it'll want to turn to the inside a lot easier. Overlocking both these edges wasn't necessary. I just like the stability it adds to the knit edge, especially if I'm going to be turning it under like this. It gives me something to make sure that when I'm folding it, I'm being nice and even, and it kind of gives the edge a little bit of a tautness so that it will help behave a little bit better. We'll do the same thing for the front. I'm going to press my opening here so it's ready for top stitching as well. I'm going to press the whole thing, kind of warm it up, get it ready to want to turn to the inside. All right, there we go. And now we'll repeat for our other pockets, and we'll top stitch them on. For my straight stitch machine here, I'm just using a ballpoint needle in here. Probably won't have any trouble sewing the fleece since it's so stable. There's two options here. We can turn this and then turn it again, or we can just turn it flat if we want a nice wide hem, or you could even trim it down and do a narrower hem. So I'm just gonna leave it flat here and stitch from the right side so I can kind of see my stitches are nice. And I'm just gonna go even to the edge here so I'm catching the serged edge. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it under my needle here and see how far away I need to be. I look at something on the bed of my machine here to line it up to. It's kind of my trick. And right there, I'm just gonna make sure that I line it up to the edge of my throat plate. And I'm gonna lengthen my stitch to a 3. I'm gonna reduce the pressure of my presser foot, which is the pressure of this right here, so that it doesn't get too hung up onto there since it's a thicker fabric. There we go. And if you get a little bit of waviness, that's okay. That will go away. If it's really extreme, then you might have some troubles. But for the most part, when you see that waviness, it will just wash away or iron away. A little bit of steam. There we go. All right, so now we can attach these to our back pants. I have some drill holes here. And I'm going to turn them upside down and turn my pocket upside down and line it up so that I close those holes. And I'm going to just pin my pocket in a couple of places so that it doesn't shift. So I've turned my pocket upside down. I've pinned it in a couple places so it doesn't shift around. And now I'm going to start at the hem, go up to the top, over to the outside, and then around the perimeter and do the same little stitch at the hem. I'm gonna make sure that little turn back corner there is nice and clean. So sometimes I'll even fold it in a little bit and then enclose it with this next little stitch sequence. I'm gonna trim this thread where I started so that it doesn't get stuck there. And now we're gonna go down. And I try and straighten this out. It's gonna be pushed a little bit because we've stitched this. So I just kind of gently push it so that it stays nice and straight. And pick up the pant and hold it while it turns. And sometimes if I feel that the pants are getting hung up, I'll sort of fold them up and pin them so they stay. If you're not able to adjust your pressure of your presser foot and you're finding that it wants to kind of like keep this edge from going under the presser foot and kind of pushing towards you, lift your presser foot up, keep your needle down, and sort of relax the tension there and get it flat again. And just do that periodically to get it to feed through nicely. All right, we're at the beginning here, so we're gonna fold down this little corner again to kind of enclose it. And I'm gonna go this way, the same number of stitches, and then down to the hem. There we go. And now we'll repeat for our other back pocket. All right, now for the front pocket here, we're going to top stitch the ribbing down. You don't have to do this, but I think it'll lay a little nicer. So we're just going to stitch about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch away. And now we can line this up to our pants. And again, I'm going to put a couple of pins to sort of stabilize it so it doesn't move around. And then we'll be able to stitch this down, starting from side seam to waist or waist to side seam. In general, you're going to get more waviness on the cross grain than you will on the length grain, but if you have a lot of stretch in the length grain, you'll get some waviness there too. And that'll be okay, that'll go away. All right, and I'm just going to go across the top and secure my pocket to the waist, and the same thing over here. There we go, and then we'll repeat that for the other front pocket. And all of our pockets will be attached. So we have our fronts and our backs pretty much ready to sew together. So we have our front here with the pocket, and we have our back on the with the pocket. And now we're gonna sew our side seam and our inseam. So we're gonna line up the side seam here at waist to hem, And then on the inseam as well here, right here, from inseam here at the crotch right here all the way to the hem, and we're going to sew these two seams. Now I've trimmed mine down so that I don't have to trim a whole lot on the serger, and I'm going to be using a 3/8 inch seam or 1 centimeter. So we're just going to sew these together. And if you're not using a serger and you're zigzagging these together, you can choose to finish your seam allowances or not, however you like. All right, so now we have our one leg, and we'll repeat for the other leg, and then we're going to do our rise, and we're going to have some pants. So now we have both of our pant legs. We're going to turn one of them right side out, and we're going to stick it inside the other one, lining up that rise. You can offset the thicknesses here at the crotch seam to kind of minimize the bulk there. And we're going to sew from waist to waist. I'm going to sew from the inside of my curve here, so you can kind of see that there's the inside of my pants. Here's my inseam, here's my other side of my waist, and so I have my curve going like this. And this way, if I sew with the inside facing up, I won't be in danger of letting any of the pants slip under the serger. As opposed to sewing with this with the outside facing up, all of this pant is under here and it can get caught under there. So I always recommend sewing it from the inside facing up, and we'll sew from waist to waist. There we go. Now we have some pants at the back and the front. Here we go. All right, so now we're going to attach our waistband and our cuffs, and we're done. Our pieces are starting to look like joggers. They're looking really cute. So now we're going to work on the waistband. Now you can follow the instructions for the waistband assembly in the Chanterelle instructions as is, and you don't have to do any of the little things I'm going to be doing. Because I plan on sewing my elastic so it's stitched into the seam of the waist rather than free floating inside the casing, I needed to cut down my waistband pattern piece, the height of it, to make sure that it's not too much fabric. So I needed to cut it down so that it's twice the width of my elastic plus a little bit more because of the thickness of the elastics. I'm using a 2-inch wide elastic. I think the 2 inch is a really good width when you're doing this because we're going to lose some of this width in the seam allowance. So basically we're losing 3/8 of an inch of it in the seam allowance. So we're essentially going to end up with a waistband that's a little over 1.5 inches wide. So if you were to start with elastic that's narrower, it's going to get that much narrower once it's sewn to the pants. Now you can just use the instructions and sew your casing just like it is in the original Chanterelles. That will work great. Now I'm also going to be adding eyelets to the front for a drawcord hole. And I've already inserted one here, and I thought I'd show you how to do one of those. So I've cut a hole here, and I've also interfaced it on the back. Eyelets are really easy, and you get a lot in a package, obviously. That's why I'm using them today. It only takes one side of the eyelet here, and you're going to insert it from the right side to the wrong side, like this. There should be an anvil, which is usually the smaller piece, and the post. We're going to keep this wrong side up, and we're going to lay this eyelet onto the anvil, and this side has a raised bevel on the middle, so we're going to nestle it right on top there, just like that. I'm protecting my work surface, and now we're going to put the beveled end of the post right on top of the hole of the eyelet. And we're going to give it a few taps with the hammer, and that's all you got to do. I also wanted to make my own drawcord because I think it's kind of cuter. So I'm using this piece of bias. I bought this bias pre-made, so I think it was 2 inches wide, and I've cut it down the middle so it's 1 inch wide, and that's just so I could get more out of it and use it for other matching projects. So I'm gonna take my drawcord, and to measure this, you're really gonna need a lot more than you think. I would definitely maybe take a tape measure, wrap it around you, or a string, and then tie it how you plan on tying it, and then measuring that length, because the little bow at the end takes a lot more than you think it will. So we're gonna fold this right sides together, And I'm going to sew this so that my drawcord is going to finish a little less than 1/4 of an inch wide because it needs to fit into that tiny eyelet that I have. I'm going to trim down the seam allowance so that I can make sure that when I turn this right side out, it's going to fit inside. I think this will probably be the hardest part of the entire Joggers project, especially since I could have sewn this a little differently. It'd be a little easier. It's a little narrow, but you could fold this together and edge stitch it rather than sewing it in a tube and turning it. Okay, got our drawcord. That really was the hardest part of this whole project. So now I'm going to press it and then I'll probably stitch along the length of it to flatten it out if I feel like the pressing isn't good enough. All right, I've measured my elastic, and remember, if you're planning on stitching through your elastic through the waistband, that's going to stretch your elastic out a little bit. So make sure that you accommodate the length for that. You might want to make it a little bit smaller. And if you're using a really thick fabric here, that also may hinder the stretch. And you might have to make it even smaller because it's going to stay partially stretched when it's inside of a thicker waistband. My waistband is pretty thin. I'm not too worried about that. And plus I'm going to be overlocking it to the waist. I'm going to overlap my elastic and I'm going to stitch it down really securely just a couple of times from top to bottom, just like that. So that's very, very secure. And make sure you also pre-stretch your elastic before you cut it because that also can change the length of it. And now we're going to sew our waistband, the short ends right sides together down here. And I'm going to press that seam open. So now we're going to section off our waistband and our elastic so that we have some landmarks to hit while we're sewing it on. So I'm going to fold it in half first, and I'll just use some chalk here. And now I'll line those 2 points up with each other like this and do the other corners. And we're going to do the same on the waistband. We sort of know that this is the center because we have the eyelets there, so that works for me. I'm going to just kind of nip here at the center. And I'll probably pin these so I make sure, because we're going to immediately grab these and attach it to the elastic. We want to make sure we don't get confused. So we have our 4 sections. All right, now we're going to place our elastic inside this casing, matching up all of these landmarks there, and I'm going to put the seamed area to the back seam. You want it in there really snug, so I'm pulling the waistband to wrap it around the elastic nice and snug. It'll look nicer if the snugger it is. And now we're just going to go around and put all of our landmarks together. All right, so now we have our 4 sections. And now we're going to stitch this all together so that it's nice and easy to deal with when we go to the serger. Threading my drawcord through my eyelets will be a little tricky at the end, but if you have a buttonhole, it's a lot easier. You can use a safety pin. The safety pin will fit through the buttonhole really easily. So I'm going to start at the back. And this is going to be good practice on how we're going to attach it to the serger. I'm going to stay inside the seam allowance, and the real key thing when you're stretching something while you're sewing is you don't want to stretch it after the machine has started. So you want to grab these 2 sections here, stretch, and you can stretch beyond, that's fine, as long as you are holding it static as it goes through the machine and you're not pulling after you started sewing. You have no risk of bending your needle or anything like that. And I'll just leave that clip in place. And we'll use a longer stitch. This is going to be in the seam allowance, nobody's going to see this. And so now I'm going to put my needle down, and now I'm going to pull, holding, making sure both sides of my waistband reach the edge of the elastic. And so now I'm going to pull and just hold it in place, and we're just making sure, and if you need more clips, go for it. My presser fit's really strong, And so it's gonna hold this all together while I'm fussing around with it. And in between, yeah, I just let it go. And then I'm always stopping needle down, pull, and then stretch. So then once I'm ready to sew, I'm stretching, and then we sew. There we go. So now we can get rid of all of our pins and clips. We'll give it a good tug to make sure that this little folded edge on the top isn't at a slant anywhere, so we can kind of distribute it nice and even. And now I would recommend doing your channel stitches now if you plan on doing it, because it'll be a lot easier to manage this under your machine than the whole pair of pants. And you can also do the drawcord now too. So we're gonna stitch the 2 rows here, and remember our seam is right here, so it's 3/8 from this raw edge here, so it's like right here. This is the middle, and we want equal thirds on the waistband. So if I do my first row a 1/2 inch from the top and my next one a 1/2 inch from there, we're gonna get 3 1/2 inch tunnels. This is a 2-inch piece of waistband, and I know I have a 3/8 inch seam here, so my bottom channel might be a little bit larger, but this is a little easier to kind of keep track of. So remember, we're gonna stretch this, and we're gonna start at the back. Now you could use a zigzag stitch for this, but if you're stretching something, then sewing it, the stitches will be in the stretched position. The stitches aren't stretched themselves, but they are on the stretched fabric. And then when you let go, they scrunch up. So you're not in danger of popping any stitches. So we're gonna start at the back here. And I'm gonna start from the right side. And I'm gonna just line that up with my 1/2 inch seam there. I'm gonna stretch and sew. I stop, adjust, stretch. All right, we'll do our next one now. So now I'm doing this one 1 inch from the top edge because I have a 1 inch mark on my throat plate here. And if you don't, you can put a piece of tape or something just to guide you and keep your top edge lined up to it. And again, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna stretch, then sew. And there we go. So now you're gonna be a pro at sewing with the elastic there in the stretched position, and you're ready to attach your waistband to your pants. All right, so let's see if this is as hard as it was to get in. All right, I forgot to record the beginning of this, but I use this blunt tapestry needle, which is usually used in knitting to weave ends in, to thread my drawstring through there. And now I'm going to knot them up so that they're not in the way when I go to sew this onto the waist. And we'll pin it out of the way. We're also going to prep our cuffs here so that we're ready to sew them when we put on our waistband. I've cut my cuffs just a little bit wider than the pattern piece, and the pattern piece also has 5/8 inch seam allowance. So it's gonna make my cuff a little bit wider than the finished cuff on the original Chanterelles. These are cut 3 inches wide, which is about 7.6 centimeters. I'm gonna sew them first in the round, so we're gonna put these short ends together. And for my fleece cuffs, I ended up pressing this seam open here, and then I stitched on either side of the seam just to kind of mash it down since it's so thick. And I think it looks nicer too, because the fleece, some of the fleeces can be kind of thick. All right, so now this cuff is ready. It'll fold wrong sides together. The other bit of prep we need to do is the leg opening here. We need to sew the pleats on view B if you're making view B. And this pleat pleats towards the center, so towards the inseam. So we're going to take that notch area here and we're going to fold it over just like this. I'm going to put 2 rows of stitches here really close together in the seam allowance to kind of keep them straight and in the right place. It'll also help mash down the thickness. And you're gonna do this for the front and for the back. On my green pair, I didn't have enough to make the full cuff. And the cuff on these isn't a traditional jogger cuff. It's not close fitting, it's pretty loose. It'll hang loose away from the body. So I had a little bit of flexibility to make that cuff smaller. So I barely had enough fabric to make the fleece cuffs that you saw. And that meant the opening was a little smaller. So I put 2 pleats until it matched the cuff circumference. All right, so now we're gonna go to the serger and we're going to attach our cuffs and our waistband and we'll be done. All right, we're ready to attach our waistband to the pants. Now you don't need a serger to do this. You can use a zigzag stitch. You can even use a straight stitch. And that's because you're stretching the waistband. Like I said earlier, you're stretching it and the stitches are gonna be in that stretched position. And then when you let go, they scrunch up. And you can always test this out and see if it works for you before you commit to doing it to your pants. I have a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I've marked the quarters again of my waistband here. So I have it in 4ths. And my pant is the same. So if I stack the centers one on top of the other, center front and center back, and I go to the side here, my side seam lands halfway. So I know that that is the quarter mark as well. So now I'm gonna place my waistband inside the pant. My pant is inside out. And I'm gonna put my waistband right sides together, lining up these 4 quarters. I've also added a label here, but you could, if you want it in the seam, now's the time to tack it to your center back if that's where you like to have it. You'll want to do that now before you sew the waistband to the seam. All right, so we're lining up our center back. I've got some clips here, so I'm not using any pins. Putting the middle of my front eyelets to the seam there. And now we'll do the sides. I'm going to press the seam toward the back. And I'm going to start at the center back. And I'm going to start before the center here, like right here. Because of this is a little bit of a thicker area, I kind of want to use the area before it as like an on-ramp to get on there and then get things sorted out. And we're going to sew just a little tiny bit, pause, and then we're going to stretch our waistband to match the pant while we're not sewing and the machine's not moving. We're just getting the machine onto the pants right now. All right, and so now I have this other corner here, and I'm probably gonna have to get a little leverage behind here and pull, so I'm not pulling on the needles or anything like that. I'm gonna pull, and now we're gonna sew. And if you need to adjust, just make sure that you stop sewing and only pull before you start sewing once it's secure. Now I'll sometimes pull and then find another spot to clip in between just to help keep it lined up to the edge. And again, notice that we're sewing on the inside of the garment. We have the garment inside out so that we're sewing on the inside and none of this garment can slip under the machine. Okay, we're on our last quarter here. Make sure you don't get a little bump right here. It likes to do that. All right, there we go. Nice and smooth. I'm gonna leave a little tail, and then that way I can tack it right here under the seam when the waistband is pressed up. Now let's see how it looks. Looks really good. Nice. Looking professional. All right, so let's put our cuffs on now. I've pressed my cuffs wrong sides together, and we're gonna match the seam to the inseam of the pants. Our pants are still inside out. This is my inseam here. And I'm going to identify the back from the front so that I know which way to press the seam. We're gonna line up that seam there. This is 1-to-1. There isn't any stretching involved unless you made your cuff smaller than the leg opening. straighten out that pleat there. Make sure it's nice and smooth. And again, I'm gonna leave this little tail here. All right, there's our cuff. Looks pretty cute, nice and casual. I'm really getting excited about wearing these. And then for that little tail at the end there, when I'm back at my other machine, I'm just gonna pull it to the seam allowance here and tack it in there so that it's sort of hidden back here. And that's it. You do your other cuff and you're done with your joggers. Thanks so much for sewing your chanterelle joggers with me. I hope you had a lot of fun like I did with this hack. Now I have so many joggers, and it's a great way to get another use out of our chanterelle pattern. And I'm ready for all the coziness. Keep an eye out for a couple more videos about sewing cozy clothes and how to attach a zipper to a zip front opening on a fleece jacket with a hood and without. Thanks for watching.